There was a proposal in mid-May from the EU Commission to postpone the due diligence obligations. Actually, there are multiple reasons that we can say. First of all, the challenging process of how these due diligence obligations are going to be addressed. So now the delays or the push is for 2 years. So that means that companies have 2 more years until August 2027. So start with a simple exercise of mapping your supply chain. Our advice is always to start earlier instead of waiting until the final date. So the due diligence obligation referred to the requirement that companies who are above 40 million euros of net turnover threshold need to comply with in terms of reporting certain segments from their supply chain. This mostly refers or is connected to 4 critical minerals. In this case, for batteries, it's the lithium, nickel, cobalt, and natural graphite. So what this means is any companies over this threshold will need on their side to develop a battery due diligence policy, which would include, which would follow the EU guidelines for due diligence, but also include details on ESG aspects according to Annex 10 and the requirements coming from the international instruments on this topic. So in short, first, the due diligence policy, then the need for adapting and creating an internal chain of custody or traceability system to record the how the batteries were made in terms of identifying the sources of these 4 critical minerals, and then aspects addressing the risk management obligation, the grievance mechanism, and the public reporting on how a company is performing on the due diligence requirements. So because it's due diligence, then it addresses the whole supply chain. So the main obligation falls on the economic operator placing the batteries on the market. However, for them to be able to comply with the due diligence means that they will need to find out who is in their supply chain. Now, the regulation puts focus on 4 critical minerals at this point. That's lithium, nickel, cobalt, and natural graphite. So that would mean that whoever is placing a battery on the European market will need to state where these raw materials are coming from, how they are moving across the supply chain, and the respective quantities of those in the batteries as an end product. So that means the whole supply chain in terms of how these raw materials move will need to be disclosed. So any company who does not have a supply chain mapping process already, or usually the status is that companies rarely know anyone below their tier 2, would have to do this supply chain mapping exercise. So this was one of the, let's say, the most challenging tasks, because we have global supply chains, material are coming from one point to another point, and it's difficult to obtain the very upstream source. So mapping this part is actually one of the most challenging tasks even nowadays, except in the case of, let's say, vertically integrated companies who control the whole chain. But those examples, I would say, are rare. Based on our discussion, supply chain mapping and creating the due diligence systems or the chain of custody system enabling is still in process. So some companies have already started doing this. Some companies have not even started. Some of them have mapped portions of their supply chain. But overall, the general experience leans towards the fact that mapping supply chain is not as easy as companies think. And usually it's very difficult to find out where the materials are coming from. So it requires a lot of dedication, collaboration across the supply chain, and incentives for all those suppliers at the very upstream and midstream part, so that they are sharing information with their end customers. So, yeah, actually, that's true. There was a proposal in mid-May from the EU Commission to postpone the due diligence obligations. And that was actually voted on in this month, in July. So basically, the regulation for postponing the regulation for batteries, meaning the due diligence obligation part, was part of the Omnibus 4 package. The reason for that is actually there are multiple reasons that we can say. First of all, the challenging process of how these due diligence obligations are going to be addressed. So a lot of companies were facing the challenges, especially coming from identifying the upstream raw material providers. Obviously, there was a bit of a delay in providing the due diligence guidelines from the EU side. So these due diligence guidelines were supposed to come in February 2025 and provide a way for companies to see how to structure the policy, then the internal systems on a company level, and then how to tie that with the international instruments that they will use as part of their risk assessments and policy integration within their companies. And then and the third part, I would say, is we know on an EU level, there are a lot of discussions on due diligence. And this is something that is also factoring in other regulations. For example, the CES Triple D is one of these regulations. So the postponement or the push, the delay in these obligations comes partially because of that part as well. Trying to align all the due diligence details on an EU level, make sure the guidelines and the notified body addressing these aspects are set in, and then there is a clear guidance for companies on how to comply or how to perform according to this part. So those were, I would say, one of the main reasons why this came. Along that, I imagine there was also push from the industry considering how challenging this whole process is and the short timeline since the battery regulation has been put in force until this regulation and parts were supposed to come in force, which was August 2025. So now the delays basically or the push is for 2 years. So that means that companies have 2 more years until August 2027 to start complying with this part. So the new update includes a couple of elements. The first one is actually the delay of the enforcement of the due diligence obligation. So now that has moved from 18th of August 2025 to 18th of August 2027. Then with that, also the non-binding due diligence guidelines from the EU Commission are also postponed. So they will be released or expected to be published in July 2026. And then there are small amendments in terms of the thresholds and reporting. So for example, if previously the threshold was 40 million euros net turnover for companies, now that threshold is increased. So it means that only companies who have a net turnover in the previous financial year of 150 million euros are subject to this due diligence obligations. So the main, let's say, direct impact goes to economic operators who fill in the threshold. So they are above the 150 million threshold and who are placing or putting the batteries in service on the market. So they are the main direct companies who need to provide all these details. However, because supply chains are not usually vertically integrated, but we have a wider span of companies from where they source materials, this is having cascaded impact on all the supply chain going upstream. So it means that the economic operator who is creating or putting the battery on the market will have to go to their tier one supplier for this information, tier one to tier two, and so on until you reach the very upstream raw material source. So these cascading effects are changing how companies are interacting one to another. So we see now that, for example, in supplier agreements, in the contract, this requirement is being put in. So that means that the supplier needs to reveal where their materials are coming from, identify the raw materials within the right details. So, for example, quantity, origin, movement, and transformation of material, and so on. So even though we say direct impact, the indirect impact goes through all the battery supply chain participants. And there is one more thing, that's the public reporting requirements. Initially, the public reporting was required once a year. So that would mean companies will need to provide an annual due diligence report for their battery due diligence policy. Now that has been changed into requiring the public reporting every 3 years. So these are, let's say, the main 4 points that have been updated with this latest proposal. So first of all, as we said, these are very complex supply chains. So it's difficult to find out who is in your supply chain for a couple of reasons. There is sensitive information. There is also sometimes no cooperation or collaboration between suppliers. So it's difficult to find a way how to obtain this information. That's why we always advise to find certain incentives and incentivize the suppliers, create awareness about this topic so everyone can see the benefits of traceability and transparency. So this is our way how we would approach things. The other point was there was the delay of the due diligence guidelines, which were causing a bit of, let's say, confusion in terms of what needs to be done and how. The verification points, so each of these policies needs to be verified, but there is still no information of accredited verifiers or notified bodies on a member state level who will handle this. So, and of course, for most of these companies, there is the cost component in doing this and resource barriers. So, especially for small and medium enterprises. So, all of these factors were kind of, let's say, challenges that companies were facing in and that they are trying to treat as they go, trying to comply with this deadline. So the first way that we would say is obviously companies should have already started with this, but the first approach would be find out who is in your supply chain. So start with a simple exercise of mapping your supply chain. Maybe it can be for one battery model, for one product in your portfolio, but start from somewhere. As you start speaking with suppliers, you will be surprised to see how things are easy or difficult to get. So once there is more knowledge of what happens in the supply chain, what are the details, how material moves, then you can better assess risks, find ways on how to better collect data, engage with suppliers and incentivize them. And of course, once you reach that point, you can use already existing tools such as chain of custody systems or the traceability system that we have at MySpider or similar, that you can start capturing this data in a digitized format. So when times comes for auditing or verification, you have one system that gathers all the information and is available for those auditing or verification practices. For some companies, maybe as we said, it's easier to start small, maybe for one battery model on a pilot phase. But we would use this phased approach. That would be our suggestion. Considering that 2 years for some companies is still enough, but then accounting for what might happen in the supply chain or what other parties we might find out is still unknown. Our advice is always to start earlier instead of waiting until the final date, because when the 18th of August 2027 comes, by that time, companies should have all the documentation. So that means they already need to be compliant, not start the process then. So it depends. It can be, it depends on the size of the company. So for smaller and medium companies, usually they can outsource some of these aspects, such as the supply chain mapping, if they don't have any capacity, let's say in-house. But for bigger companies, we've seen that usually they have dedicated teams handling sustainability, compliance, and procurement. Mm-hmm. So between them, they can much more easier do the process. So I would say it will depend on the size of the company. We, on our side, we have partners with which we are working on for the supply chain mapping aspects. And we, as the technology provider, have the chain of custody and traceability aspects combined with the product passports to make sure all these details, as they flow from one point to another point, are also digitally recorded and created on the platform.